This is amateur hour, and it needs to stop. What does this even mean for your negotiating strategy? How are you in charge of negotiation?
Without tariffs, this country would be in such trouble, as they were for many years. That's why we owe $38 trillion.
This is all I know. Can't do it any better.
For years, wheat was invisible. It crossed the U.S.-Canada border quietly, without headlines or political speeches. Railcars rolled south. Flour mills blended grain. Grocery shelves stayed stocked. It was one of the most stable supply relationships in North America, until it wasn't. When President Donald Trump escalated trade pressure on Canada and imposed new tariffs, wheat was treated like just another lever in a negotiation. The logic seemed straightforward. Apply pressure, force concessions, restore leverage. But wheat wasn't steel, and Canada wasn't cornered. Instead of rushing to Washington, Mark Carney made a colder calculation. If the United States wanted to politicize food supply, Canada would simply reduce its dependence on the U.S. market. And that's exactly what happened. The United States produces roughly 50 million tons of wheat each year. On paper, that sounds like independence. In reality, it's more complicated. American farms grow mostly lower protein winter wheat. It works for certain products, but premium bread flour, artisan baking, and pasta require very specific grain qualities. That's where Canada comes in. Spring wheat from Saskatchewan regularly hits protein levels near 14%. Durum wheat from Manitoba is essential for pasta production. American mills are built around blending Canadian high-protein wheat with domestic supplies to create consistent flour. Equipment settings, contracts, and product formulas are calibrated to that system. Canada supplies nearly 90% of U.S. wheat imports. So when tariffs of up to 25% were imposed on Canadian wheat, the shock wasn't theoretical, it was immediate. In 2024, the U.S. imported around 120 million bushels of wheat, worth roughly $784 million. A 25% tariff meant nearly $200 million in additional costs overnight. For individual flour companies, that translated into millions of dollars in unexpected expenses. Mills had two options: absorb the cost or pass it along. Margins in flour milling are thin. Absorption wasn't realistic. Prices started moving. Washington expected Ottawa to negotiate. Instead, Carney pivoted. Canada produces about 35 to 36 million tons of wheat annually and exports roughly 2/3 of it to more than 60 countries. Historically, less than 1/5 of that went to the United States. The dependency imbalance was clear. America relied heavily on Canadian wheat imports, while Canada had a diversified global customer base. Carney accelerated that diversification. Shipments to Mexico expanded first. A high-profile rail shipment of Canadian wheat rolled through U.S. territory without unloading, symbolizing a shift in trade flows. Mexico increased contracts. Milling agreements grew. Then came Asia. China, which imports about 10 million tons of wheat annually, expanded Canadian purchases. Southeast Asian buyers, including Indonesia and the Philippines, deepened contracts. North African markets increased volume. Brazil explored new supply blends. Canadian wheat didn't disappear. It simply stopped prioritizing the U.S. market. American mills struggled to replace it. Russia and Ukraine were politically volatile. European wheat lacked consistent protein levels for U.S. blending needs. Australia was heavily committed to Asian markets. Argentina focused on South America. There was no easy substitute. Flour prices rose, bread and pasta followed, grocery chains adjusted. The price increases weren't explosive, but they were steady enough to be felt by consumers. What Washington underestimated was how sticky supply chains become once they shift. Once Canada signed new multi-year contracts, rerouted logistics, and built stronger relationships in Asia and Latin America, there was no automatic reason to return to old patterns. Buyers prefer stable suppliers. Sellers prefer predictable partners. Carney framed the shift as resilience. Canada would no longer structure its agricultural economy around a single dominant market. Wheat became part of a broader strategy that includes diversifying potash, energy, and lumber exports. The leverage math told the story. The U.S. imports nearly 90% of its imported wheat from Canada. Canada exports less than 20% of its wheat to the United States. That imbalance meant tariffs hurt American buyers more than Canadian producers in the long run. Trump's approach assumed Canada would bend quickly. Instead, Ottawa absorbed short-term disruption and expanded globally. The U.S. discovered that agricultural systems cannot pivot overnight. You cannot instantly grow high-protein spring wheat in regions not suited for it. You cannot redesign milling infrastructure in a single season. And you cannot restore trust with a press release. By the time pressure built within Washington to ease enforcement, the shift was already underway. Canadian exporters had diversified. Infrastructure aligned with new contracts. The US market was no longer central. It was optional. That's what frozen permanently really means. Not an embargo, not a total cutoff, but the end of automatic dependence. Wheat exposed a weakness in tariff strategy. Food supply chains operate on biology, climate, and long-term relationships, not campaign cycles. Once confidence freezes in a trade partnership, it doesn't thaw easily. Trump demanded leverage. Carney responded with redirection. And in doing so, Canada demonstrated that in a global market, loyalty isn't guaranteed. Reliability is earned. The result isn't empty American shelves. It's something subtler but more lasting. A supply relationship that once seemed permanent is no longer assumed. And in global trade, that shift alone changes everything.